All right, we're going to be talking in this segment about the recent elections in Sierra Leone, but we wanted to start speaking of the COVID hearing that took place yesterday with a reference of Sierra Leone that came in the opening statement by virologist Bob Gary here. Let's roll this.
For nearly 20 years, I've worked closely with scientists and clinicians at the Chernoh Government Hospital in Sierra Leone. KGH is a major site for research on the virus that causes Lassa fever. 10 years ago, Ebola virus emerged just 50 miles from Chernoh. Ultimately, this Ebola outbreak would claim the lives of thousands of people, including dozens of healthcare workers at the Chernoh Government Hospital.
So we're going to be joined in this segment by Sierra Leonean journalist Chernoh Bah, who many of you may remember we interviewed him several months ago about his book on the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone. So I wanted to ask him about this. First, Chernoh, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So what did you think about hearing Gary bring up the lab in Sierra Leone? And particularly, I noticed that he referenced the work that the lab does on the Lassa virus, which nobody asked him what kind of work was going on in that lab. There's been an enormous amount of reporting, yours most prominently, that there was a lot of Ebola research going on in that lab as well. Papers were written by scientists from that lab about that Ebola research. Did it strike you the same way it struck me that he got so specific about the Lassa virus work being done in that lab?
In my book, I had even mentioned the fact that the CDC had been present in the region since the 1970s doing Lassa fever work and funding Lassa fever research. So, in fact, that was what triggered my interest in investigating the Ebola outbreak and arguing or pointing to the fact that we cannot understand the causes of the Ebola outbreak without looking at what the Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium was doing in the region 10 years preceding the outbreak. So it did not surprise me that any effort to understand COVID will have to first start with the same, kind of work that was done in West Africa, because we're talking about the same individuals and the same groups of scientists, organizations that were involved there. So we have been calling for an investigation into the Ebola outbreak, and unfortunately, since the outbreak, this is the first time we are having some kind of hearings that appear to reference the outbreak in West Africa. We are hoping that a similar kind of investigation, or at least a hearing that drills into the questions that we have been asking years ago, might happen.
Yeah, and for people who missed it, we'll put the link to your previous interview in the notes to this one. But today we wanted to talk about the presidential election in Sierra Leone, which you mentioned in your last interview. So can you bring us up to speed? What are the kind of political parties and political formations in Sierra Leone that were competing in this election?
Well, politics and power in Sierra Leone has been dominated by two major factions, as I call them, of the elite, divided into two parties known as the Sierra Leone People's Party, the SLPP, that is currently in power, and the major opposition party, the All People's Congress, that was previously in power before this current party that's in power. In fact, the APC was in power when the Ebola outbreak that we just mentioned happened. So it appears that these two parties have been there for the more than 60 years now, since the transition to what we call independence. And they have dominated, the elites of these parties have dominated and monopolized politics for the last 60 years. There has been no all-independent effort to organize against these two factions of the middle class, as I call them, over the years, have not been, have not succeeded in displacing them. Part of the reason is that there seems to be some kind of arrangement where they rotate power after every 10 years. And this is the first time where individuals, groups of regular citizens mobilized to vote against a government that has openly become dictatorial and repressive over the last 5 years. Dozens of people have been killed, and no investigation or hearing has been done on that situation. And we have highlighted corruption and the dictatorial tendencies of the government. So the elections that happened, the current president declared himself or was declared winner of the elections when the elections were incomplete. Votes were not fully counted, they were not fully tabulated. And pretty much every organization that has been or that was present during the voting process, and this includes the Carter Center and the European Union and various other international organizations that supposedly went there to monitor the elections, have classified them as non-transparent elections. But we are pointing to the fact that it's not just a question of lack of transparency, but there is illegalities surrounding the way the elections were conducted. So in a general sense, we had no proper elections. They just decided to allow the president to continue because there appears to be a consensus among these parties, both the opposition party and the ruling party, to allow the president to continue for 2 terms, because that appears to be the only time they shift power amongst themselves.
And you report extensively on this corruption in your article, and we can put that up on the screen. That's the next element. I want to ask Chernoh about what the hope is and what the next steps are for people outside of the ruling party and the opposition party who you say they've reached a consensus, allowing corruption to continue festering and illegitimate elections to be rubber stamped. What does it look like for people who have hope for democracy that looks less corrupt than this going forward?
Well, that is what we have been putting forward. If they agree that the only legitimate means of changing the government is through the ballot box, and groups of organizations, including the United States, governments around the world who are partners of the corrupt politicians in Sierra Leone, will not just call that kind of facade as an election, because where an election is where people are allowed to freely participate. We have a law that was brought in Parliament a year before the election that gave the Electoral Commission and the current president the power to determine how the elections will be conducted, and they program the political environment in a way that we will have the current outcome that we have. So we expect these individuals who claim that that's the only way to compete for power to respect the rules that they have developed for them, for these kinds of competitions. But they have openly allowed the subversion of that kind of situation. And as we speak right now, there has not been any significant effort to call into question the current situation in Sierra Leone. What we hear is just issues of transparency. It goes way beyond that. We have to talk about the responsibility of these individuals, both the United States, Europe, and the politicians in Sierra Leone, in holding each other responsible for denying Sierra Leoneans the right to decide the kind of government under which they want to live.
Chernoh, can you give us a couple examples of the kinds of irregularities that have been uncovered?
Well, they include virtually the failure of the Electoral Commission to properly count the votes, to properly tabulate the election. But up and above that, the law requires that in order for a presidential election to be, for a winner of a presidential election to be announced, they have to count the ballot, the votes in the polling stations, then at the district level, at the regional level, before the results are collated and tabulated at the national office. And that was not done. In fact, individuals who supervised the election, ordinary citizens, and including political parties, complained that, in fact, district returning officers and regional officers had not completed their own tabulation process, their own calculations, when the presidential election results were announced. So that means that what the Electoral Commission announced was basically the result of numbers. They just came out with their own numbers that do not reflect the actual votes that the people were counted. So up to now, we have been asking for, where are the votes of the people? And even international organizations are so embarrassed to the point that they are now asking for disaggregated, for the numbers to be disaggregated, basically for the Electoral Commission to show how they came up with the figures from the polling stations to the district centers and the regional centers, and that has not been done.
You mentioned this earlier, but what more can you tell us about how the West and the United States and other international organizations are reacting to the results, I should say that in air quotes, out of Sierra Leone?
Well, they've just classified the elections as non-transparent elections, but we are saying that it goes way beyond just the question of transparency, that the Electoral Commission organizing the elections in a secret fashion or not allowing people access to monitor the elections. It deals with a range of irregularities and illegalities where the elections we are not conducted following the public elections laws. So an election does not conform to the rules and regulations that we have in that country for the conduct of elections. It's basically an illegal arrangement. So any government that results from the illegal conduct of elections is an illegal regime. So it has to be called that way. But when you just describe the situation as non-transparent, it is an ambiguous way of basically, it opens the discussion to conceptual issues rather than the actual crime that has been committed. But it's so unfortunate because on June 30th, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation approved $150 million loan to the Suma Group, which is a private company that's in charge of running the national airport in Sierra Leone. And that airport was built by that company through a contract awarded to them by the current government and the parliament without proper scrutiny and without citizens being aware of the details of that agreement. So such kinds of funding that goes to fund projects and programs undertaken by the government of Sierra Leone, by the United States and Europe, even as we speak of these kinds of illegalities and discrepancies in voting processes and the way the country is being run, emboldens dictators and leaders like the current president of Sierra Leone, who is openly stealing votes. So we have, a year ago, we have, in the African Express, we've published the fact that the current government cannot win a free and fair election based on the objective conditions on the ground. The desperate economic situation, the economic crisis, coupled with the dictatorial tendencies of the government, the authoritarian nature of how they've run the government corruption that we've reported about. So we knew that the only way the government is going to retain power is by rigging the elections. And we have also pointed in advance that they cannot rig the elections without the complicity of the opposition parties on the ground, and which is why we have been calling for effective international monitoring of the elections. And it ended up into a situation where the politicians ganged up to steal the popular mandate of the people in front of the whole world. So we believe such kinds of governments cannot be funded. The US and their European partners cannot continue to give taxpayers' money to politicians who steal elections, because any individual who steals a national election cannot be trusted with the management of a national economy, let alone being awarded loans and grants, more debts from international organizations like the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. So the U.S. has to hold itself accountable to its own standards of governance that it claims to promote around the world, which is that's the message we want to call. We expect them to be able to impress upon their partners around the world, including the government of Sierra Leone, the need to maintain human rights, the need to respect the freedoms of its own citizens. And not only that, to impress upon them the minimum standards of good governance and accountability. So when they give loans like the current credit that they've approved for the funding and expansion of the Sierra Leone airport, it emboldens leaders like Julius Maada Bio, who has hijacked the mandate of the people, and they've transformed the country into a colony of gangsters.
And two final questions for you. As a socialist, you've been critical of both of these parties. I remember you were hopeful that the elections might lead to some pathway toward the end of your exile. You're currently joining us, from Chicago rather than Sierra Leone, because of the work that you've done uncovering corruption in Sierra Leone. So I'm curious, one, what do you think these election results mean for you personally? But then also, two, what do they mean for the long-term future of Sierra Leone if people decide that democracy is just a facade, that there's no point in participating in it? Are they going to seek channels outside of electoralism that could lead toward violence and other ways of enacting policy change, or that there clearly is demand for?
Yes, the entire West African region is prone to conflict. If you look around West Africa now, you have crisis and political conflict in Guinea-Conakry as a result of rigged elections. We look at the unstable situation in Nigeria, and we have elections coming up in Liberia. So Ivory Coast was recently faced with the same kind of political crisis. We have Mali, and the entire region is in conflagration. We have the same kind of issues they were dealing with in Senegal not too long, a few weeks ago, where masses of young people were out on the street demanding for more accountable leadership and effective participation. So what these kinds of situations, when you have regular citizens, men and women, who are living on trading fruits and vegetables, that the totality of which is not more than $5, living that and then standing on queues for the rest of the day, and trying to see if the ballot box can serve as an instrument to make their voices heard, are denied that opportunity, then you open up the space for other kinds of possibilities. People might think of other ways to actualize their own citizenship. And we must remember the fact that Sierra Leone, not too long ago, that entire region, Liberia and Sierra Leone, were in conflict. We entered into civil war for 10 years because we had a dictatorial one-party state that was there from 1970s right up to the 1990s. By 1991, we had a conflict that ended in 2001. And we are hoping that we cannot have the same groups of organizations that led the country to war, programming the country into the pathway to more conflict and the possibility of crisis. So that's what we've been warning against. Personally, I've been affected by that situation because I am currently unable to go back home for doing nothing other than just highlighting and advocating that governments must be transparent. Leaders should be held accountable to the basic principles of governance and transparency, and we cannot have a full of people, less than 1% of the population, holding on to the state and using it as a basis of personal aggrandizement instead of providing basic economic and social services for the rest of the population. As we speak now, major parts of Sierra Leone lack electricity supply. More than 90% of the country's population do not have the basic conditions of human existence. Absence of adequate housing facilities, healthcare is a problem, education is a challenge. Some of the worst statistics when it comes to infant and maternal mortality rates, these conditions are the result of corruption, of mismanagement that has been ongoing with impunity by the politicians of the two dominant factions. And we were hoping that at this time, these elections that just got rigged openly in front of the whole world would have empowered citizens with the belief and the faith that at least the ballot box can answer to their own problems, can serve as a check to these kinds of politics of a banditry that we have experienced for the last 60 years. But unfortunately, while these politicians are looting public funds, they openly ganged up to loot the votes of citizens. People, they just announce results without properly counting the votes. It cannot get worse than that.
All right. Well, Chernoh Bah, thank you so much for your reporting, and thanks for joining us on the show. Chernoh is an editor of Africanist Press. Thanks again for joining us. And that'll do it for us today. Thanks, everybody, for watching Counterpoints.
Absolutely, Ryan. It was great to have you back.
Good to be back, and we'll see you next week.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.